Hey guys, that was a little ASCII 2 animation from I think it's from the early 90s or the 80s. Anyways, if you back out on it, you can see it's a representation of Jimi Hendrix, and there's a bunch of other videos like that online. ASCII 2 spelled ASCII, and you should find it. So this is part one of a multi-part lecture on the mythos of technology. And the things we're going to cover are general digitization as a concept, thinking about how to understand the world through parts, and then computing and, in fact, networking as a social expression and not just a functional expression like a calculator. We'll also look at some historical concerns, historical issues around data and communication in the module on Canvas. I believe I have for you guys a reading by Lovmanovich, and in that reading he talks about something called the database aesthetics, and he talks about narratives, storytelling, and the appearance of infinite choices among predetermined choices as creativity. We'll also look at art, computer, and software network as creative tools. So what is a mythos? A mythos is a pattern of beliefs expressing symbolically the characteristic or prevalent attitudes of a group or a culture. A mythos could also be considered kind of like an ontology, or a way of the assumed conditions upon which ideas, customs, or things like that in a culture are based upon. It's kind of the unstated. So I started to think about how are we going to talk about the computer, which is such a seemingly endless and huge topic. And so what I thought was we could use some of our knowledge that you guys gained during the advertising project to look at how some technology in both hardware and software companies, what are some of the techniques that they use to convince customers or consumers to spend their money in a particular way, and where are these presumptions coming from? And so, really, instead of asking whether or not computers are good or bad or any of that kind of junk, I'm more curious about where do they come from? What were some of the assumptions that people had when they were making computers? What need were they filling, and what needs did they create? And were those needs actual needs, or were they fabricated needs for the sake of business? And then finally, if these promises and the possibilities of digital technology are true, and what I mean by that is that they hold some kind of a cultural validity, right, overall, not just that we believe it or we all understand it or that we all agree with it, but that in fact, if we strip away all of the hoo-ha and the advertising and the promises, that in fact, yeah, we need this stuff, and in fact, it might be a part of who we are. One of the main things I want to do in this lecture is to kind of demystify the computer and give it a more, in quotes, human face, so that you all can see that while digital art is pretty much kind of woven into our culture at this point, it comes from somewhere, and a lot of the driving forces that gave rise to computing and the way that we understand, say, that the graphical user interface, which is a GUI with a mouse and a keyboard, is something that was kind of accidental, and also something that could have been thought of in different ways. And one example would be sort of the not just the point and click, but also using your fingers in direct interaction. So I thought I would go to some dictionaries, and I looked at what does the word digital mean over time. I looked at 1919 dictionary, the Winston Simplified Dictionary, and the only thing that came up, and this is not a definitive dictionary by any means, but it's pretty simple. It doesn't have anything computational involved. Moving along up to 1962, we still have the finger or the toe reference, but now we're starting to get into linear measure, and we're starting to look at any of the Arabic figures, which is 0 through 9, which it would be maybe a base 10 system. And so here, even in the early 60s, you do start to have an association with digital, with the kind of what they call disaggregation, or the taking apart of things, to consider them as parts of a whole. And so one of the things that's fascinating to me, this is 1993, is to kind of trace how we start thinking about digital technology in history, when those changes happen, and why they became so comfortable to us, and why we let a lot of these things go unquestioned. For example, next time you're looking at your Instagram or TikTok or anything like that, you might go to it and not even question whether or not it's a good idea, but how you interact with it, which is a step ahead. In 1993, the digital computer was more or less hitting markets with some kind of ubiquity, right? It was all over the place. I think I bought my first computer in 1993, but I think it's interesting, and that from 1947, and in dictionaries they look at the origins of these words, and it's a computer that operates with numbers expressed directly as digits, compared to an analog computer or hybrid computer. So this might be, I guess the easiest way to think about it would be like an MP3 file for music, or MP4 for video, as opposed to, say, like a record or a CD. Even though CD is digital, it's still read over time. Or for that matter, say like film, right? And so I thought I'd just look up what is a computer. A computer, the word computer didn't even exist in 1919, other than one who computes, which is where you see right there in the first definition. Here I'm going to play for you guys some old advertising for computers. And one of the goals here is I just want you to kind of absorb in what are the promises, what are the presumptions that are going along with this. And so, for example, if you use some of your the knowledge that you gained through advertising, you could look at things like the promised land or the bandwagon or any of those kinds of things. And these are just simply marketing strategies. However, when the internet really becomes a widespread in widespread use, we end up sort of glossing over some of the tactics that were used to get computers in our hands and in our lives, and then instead question what we were doing with them instead of whether or not we should be doing anything with them. And of course, we can't, go back in time and reinvent the wheel here, but I just thought it would be neat to look back at some older advertising and look at the promises that technology, or look at the promises that having a computer or computing or video gaming made to us, and how exciting that might have been.
A day in the life of a Commodore 64. Commodore 64. Once you get it, you'll wonder how you got along without it.
Commodore 64, this is from the late 1970s, early 80s. And Commodore 64 was one of the first sort of user-friendly computers. And if you scroll back, you can see some of the assumptions going on there that, for example, from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, people are just staring at the screen. That little girl's learning to type, which had always been kind of a core curriculum in high schools, and I don't know if it still is or not, but it seems this is some IBM.
The IBM PC Junior runs only about this much software. So wouldn't they be pleased to know that PC Junior runs over 50 of the most up-to-date word processing programs, over 25 mailing list and 15 database programs.
This is from about 1984, you guys.
Personal finance and home management. There are 15 programs for communications and another 15 for the stock market. Over 200 for general business. Over 300 for education. 10 programs to help you write your own programs. and hundreds more to help you do almost anything. Plus powerful new cartridge programs like Lotus 123. The truth is, PC Junior runs over 1,000 of the best, most up-to-date programs. And with its new memory expansion attachment, it can run well over 1,000 more. PC Junior from IBM, the computer that's growing by leaps and bounds.
So those black square things that the tramp kind of figure was putting up there are what are called floppy disks, and each one of those floppy disks, I think, could hold just not quite 3.5 megabytes of information. So in order to load an application, you had to insert, take out, insert, take out. Is quite a long process. So this is from late 70s news story.
Well, sitting down to your morning coffee, turning on your home computer to read the day's newspaper. Well, it's not as far-fetched as it may seem. In fact, both local San Francisco papers are investing a lot of money to try and get a service just like that started. Science editor Steve Newman reports on one person already using the brand new system.
17 stories up in his fashionable North Beach apartment, Richard Halloran is calling a local number that will connect him with a computer in Columbus, Ohio. Meanwhile, across town, in this less-than-fashionable cubbyhole at the San Francisco Examiner, these editors are programming today's copy of the paper into that same Ohio computer. When the telephone connection between these two terminals is made, the newest form of electronic journalism lights up Mr. Halloran's television with just about everything the Examiner prints in its regular edition. That is, with the exception of pictures, ads, and the comics. 8 newspapers around the country are currently in the computer network, and within the next few weeks, 3 others will join in.
This is an experiment. We're trying to figure out what it's going to mean to us as editors and reporters and what it means to the home user. And we're not in it to make money. We're probably not going to lose a lot, but we aren't going to make much either.
Both Examiner and Chronicle began service within the last 2 weeks and printed full-page ads about it. Of the estimated 2,000 to 3,000 home computer owners in the Bay Area, the Chronicle reports over 500 have responded by sending back coupons. Even though the electronic newspaper isn't as spiffy looking as the ads imply, people using the system are excited about its potential.
With this system, we have the option not only of seeing the newspaper on the screen, but also optionally we can copy it. So anything we're interested in, we could go back in again and copy it onto paper and save it, which I think is the future of the type of interrogation an individual will give to the newspapers.
This is only the first step in newspapers by computer. Engineers now predict the day will come when we get all our newspapers and magazines by home computer, but that's a few years off. So for the moment at least, this fellow isn't worried about being out of a job. Steve Newman, News Center 4.
Well, it takes over 2 hours to receive the entire text of the newspaper over the phone, and with an hourly use charge of $5, the new telepaper won't be much competition for the 20-cent street edition.
So you can see there that there wasn't a whole lot of hope with regard to the internet as an information kind of distributor. But of course, as you know, I thought it was kind of funny because, of course, we naturally it's like a foregone conclusion that we can read updated news. I'm going to pause this for a minute. So the news stories and the ads, these are also from 1984. This is an Apple ad from 1984, and I showed you the Charlie Chaplin ad from IBM, which was kind of not terribly creative, but this was a big deal in 1984 when Apple Computer came on the scene. Up until that point, it was only it was just the Commodore 64 and some other minor kind of do-it-yourself computers. In fact, the first Apple computer that was sold was a kind of a do-it-yourself thing. So you'll see.
We celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. Created for the first time in all history a garden of pure ideology where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of a contradictory rules. Purification of the rules is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will fire them with their own confusion. We
1984, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So Apple was really smart in the sense, as an advertiser, that they began to market not the functions of the computer, like, for example, through the IBM ad where you had the Charlie Chaplin figure stacking up a visible analogy to how powerful this machine was, as though those floppy disks mean anything to anybody. Instead, Apple started to use Orwell's 1984, the novel, as a analog or a reference to the personal computing, or what we might call PCs now, which was a kind of an ASCII2 or C++ language based computing. Apple was one of the first ones to create what's called a graphical user interface, where what you see is what you get. We looked at some of these ads in the past when we were going over advertising, and again, like, what are the promises that are being made here? How are they positioning their product? Because if you think about the computer is a product, right? It's a thing, it's a tool that we use. Now, however, the computer is something that has crossed over into not simply a tool, but also part of and an extension of our own ability to communicate with each other. And as such, I'd like you guys to go back to that notion of the message and the messenger, and think about, what are these messengers wearing? What are the trappings? So in this case, Think Different campaign was after Steve Jobs came back to Apple, and instead of comparing and contrasting the usefulness of one computer or another, what they did was they aligned themselves with great thinkers of history, great revolutionaries, and put their logo on it. So if you go back and listen to the Naomi Klein No Logo, you can also understand where this is coming from. And so it's the Think Different campaign. That's a young Steve Jobs. This is the full video version.
The crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them, but the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
So you can see that just by virtue of association, and even in the earlier module on visual literacy, you can see that this was a lot like a metonymy, like an associative arrangement of people and ideas. And so these are some static ads. Again, IBM, International Business Machines. This is a company that really had its origins in the 1930s around population and population control, not control, but, well, the Nazis ended up using a subsidiary of IBM's computer, which was for classifying human beings. This IBM ad is more like I want you guys to think about, what are the promises, again, being made? What are the mythos or the shared understandings about computers that are being communicated tacitly? And what I mean by the word tacit is sort of under the radar, the invisible messages that are being sent. So the person's looking directly at you, there's an assertiveness to it, they're in charge, and they're in charge because of their computer, and that's implied. But there's no computer other than the logo. So we're obviously in a post kind of we're in a logo sphere, to put it like Naomi Klein. It's about data. If you and again, we're talking about the background of databases and data that occupy those databases, which is to do with retrieval. There's also this sort of play on fantasy. This is a really early iPod ad, which I think is kind of funny. But early iPod ad was that you are more free if you're isolated, which is kind of interesting. They had these ads where a bunch of people were dancing in silence on the beach, all listening to the same playlist. And so there was this real marketing of this exacerbation of the belief of the individual containing as much power as a collective, and that you are your data. And this is the Verizon guy, Can You Hear Me Now? This is quite famous. I don't even know if anybody remembers where it came from at this point, but cellular technology was also up and coming in the 90s. Cell phones really, believe it or not, some generations, some of the folks in our class may remember a time when phones weren't mobile. But yeah, this is the Verizon network Can You Hear Me Now guy. And Moto, hello Moto. So again, like, what are the promises? It's this promised land kind of a thing, right? So here is this famous actor dressed fabulously, and a part of his accoutrement is his like phone, right? And he's also in this kind of glacial, interesting, otherworldly background, so that you can go wherever you want to have your phone work. And so as we move on, this is an image of a printed document that uses a font called blackface. And the black, well, it's an early calligraphic representation of what later became blackface. This is a calligraphic script, and what I'll do in the next episode is talk to you guys a little bit about where mass communication started, and we'll start to look at the different origins of things. So again, what I'm trying to do with these lectures is to demystify the origins of the computer, make them more real and tangible, so that we can consider the computer and networked communication not as a sign of the future, but as an extension of what we're already doing as human beings.